Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
General Electric, GE, made headlines back in 2022 when it decided to close Crotonville, its storied corporate campus in New York's Hudson Valley. In its heyday, GE was known for making, well, almost everything, from trains to microwaves. It also had a reputation for making good managers who took classes in leadership at that Crotonville office park. And many of them eventually left GE to run other companies.
GE for years was the training ground, the original CEO factory.
Matt Boyle covers work and management for Bloomberg, and he says Crotonville was legendary.
It was just sort of this sprawling facility upstate, just not far from the city, where you would go, and it wouldn't just be like a one-day leadership seminar like a lot of companies would do, where you might get a guest speaker from Harvard Business School.
Do a trust fall.
Yeah, you would stay there. You would stay there for days and days, and you would of course also learn the ins and outs of like some of GE's, like their Six Sigma, black belt, management techniques. Then you would hear from management professors.
If you're a fan of the sitcom 30 Rock, all of this may sound familiar. One of the main characters, Jack Donaghy, the brassy network boss played by Alec Baldwin, had climbed to the top of GE's corporate ladder.
I'm giving the keynote address at the company's Six Sigma retreat to move forward in Croton-on-Hudson.
Oh, is that like a corporate retreat?
Donaghy is so nervous about that speech, he makes Liz Lemon, Tina Fey's character, go with him.
Lemon, the retreat to move forward is a global meeting of GE's best and brightest. Careers are made there.
It's no wonder Jack Donaghy was anxious. GE's training center was where the company put managers through their paces.
Your weaknesses would be identified. They would be worked on, really hammering home if your weakness was in financial statements or on the finance side, if your weakness was on marketing. They would work on those and they would just churn through hundreds of people.
That rigorous training made those GE managers attractive to other companies when they were looking for new leadership. And by virtue of how big GE was and how much it did, those trainees had broad experience.
They were a conglomerate. So you could work in, jet engines. You could work in GE Capital. You could work making refrigerators. And if you were the head of that business unit, you were basically the CEO of a Fortune 1000 company. It did a lot for their global stature to be like, if you learn how to be a CEO at GE, you can run anything.
So Matt says it was the end of an era when GE closed Crotonville and sold it, raising questions about where the next generation of executives would come from and what values they'd learn along the way.
Just 36 companies accounted for preponderance of S&P 1,500 CEOs over the years. So we knew these factories always existed. What we didn't know, though, was how they were changing. So I said, well, if GE's not the preeminent CEO factory anymore, who is?
I'm David Gura, and this is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. Today on the show, the next generation of CEO factories, the new pipeline for executive talent, where tomorrow's CEOs are learning to lead, and what that says about global business. For years, GE's management training program was the gold standard, according to Bloomberg's Matt Boyle. And other companies sought to emulate GE's approach.
So that model was replicated, not perfectly, but look at a Procter & Gamble, where if you were running Pampers or something, you were basically the CEO of a global company, or even abroad at Siemens, the German conglomerate, Honeywell, IBM, this was replicated. Johnson & Johnson is another one. So you had these sort of other CEO factories coming up, but traditionally GE was the be-all, end-all. So if you went through Crotonville, whether you only spent, a few days there or a few months, you're really seen as sort of this management material.
I know they sold it off in 2024, so there's a delicious metaphor there. But what led to the end of GE's reign as a a factory for CEOs.
Well, a lot of it was, the end of GE as
Right.
sort of the paragon of American business. Its fall from grace has been well chronicled by Bloomberg and by other outlets, certainly. But once you get broken up, once the bloom is off the rose in terms of the CEOs you are producing and sending out into the world, not exactly distinguishing themselves, as you saw with some of the people, especially more recently, the GE alums who have gone to run Boeing into the ground, basically. Yeah, Barb Nodelli at Home Depot, some of them not really setting the world on fire. And so it sort of just ceased to be the factory that it was. It's still churning out very talented business executives, of course. But once you got past that period in the 90s and the aughts where it was, on a pedestal, but I think GE, since they were so high up, had the furthest to fall.
And as that happened, as GE struggled to find its footing and broke up, we saw big tech continue to rise. But replicating the kind of leadership that sets those companies apart isn't easy.
We had Mark Gurman on the show, our colleague at Bloomberg who covers Apple, and he was talking about the uniqueness of that company, that they've tried to bring in outside executives, and it's failed time and time again. There's something about Apple's culture that can't be replicated. It's hard to get somebody to come in and recognize what it is or how to operate in that world. How much of an outlier is it as you see it? Are there still major companies today in tech or other sectors that are just kind of, by virtue of the way they're built or they've evolved, kind of resistant to having somebody come in from the outside to run them?
Yeah, and I think what Mark said is totally true. Another supporting point there is how hard it is to come out of those big tech firms and be successful as a CEO elsewhere. That was
not happening a lot.
No, that was a big head scratcher.
Matt worked with a data research group called Live Data Technologies.
I said, okay, well, can you just tell us where every public company CEO over the past 20 years has come from, or where have they ever worked? What's on their resume? And so we generated this data set that showed over 3 5-year periods how the factories, so to speak, have risen and fallen. When these rankings came in and we're looking down the list of the top CEO factories, first thing we said was, where's Apple? Mm-hmm. Where's Meta? Where's Amazon? Where are all these tech titans that are these days the sort of paragons of business? Whatever they do, whether it's their return to office policy or their approach to China, companies model themselves on big tech these days. And so we said, well, where are they? And we realized there's a couple of reasons why you don't see a lot of the big tech firms outside of IBM. One reason is posited to us is that when you leave big tech, you often go into the world of venture capital. You want to invest. You want to invest in the next Meta or the next Google. So that kind of takes them out of the running to be a corporate CEO. Another reason is that they're often very skilled in being what's called like a product CEO rather than a general management CEO. So their skills are really applicable to launching the next iPhone or launching some sort of software as a service type of thing, but they're very constrained to tech, and you can't just take them out of tech and then send them to some other company and be like, okay, now go sell refrigerators. So you don't have that GE model that you used to. And a third reason is they're just young. They don't have enough of a track record. Meta only went public in 2012, which is just like halfway through the time period we were looking at here. So there's just not enough executives that they've hired to go off into the wilderness and become CEOs elsewhere. So that might change. We might see some more CEOs in corporate America or the corporate world writ large who have that big tech pedigree. But for now, not as many.
So there was the underrepresentation of big tech, and another trend emerged in the data.
And it just hit me over the head immediately as soon as I saw the chronological breakdown of how the professional services firms and the consulting firms were just slowly, steadily, and then all of a sudden, occupying nearly the entire top 10. In our top 10, we have McKinsey, Accenture, the Adecco Group, EY, Deloitte, and PwC. And so you start to think, well, where's IBM? Where's GE? They're still there, but much further down. So they've been knocked from their perch. And I think this is the first sort of story that really takes a look at here is the case and here's why.
So how did large consulting firms become the new CEO pipeline? And how is that changing business? That's next. Pop quiz. What do Sundar Pichai, Sheryl Sandberg, and James Gorman have in common? They all used to work at McKinsey. My colleague Matt Boyle has been reporting on this trend that the new pipeline for executive talent runs from consulting firms to C-suites. And he's been thinking a lot about what's required of a modern-day executive.
So it's 2025. What are the qualities or assets in a good CEO today? I imagine that definition has changed in recent decades.
It really has. I mean, it speaks to the evolution of the role of the CEO. One big thing I came across is adaptability. You have to be able to adapt quickly to an ever-changing world. And if you talk about ever-changing world today is a perfect example in terms of the word uncertainty being used, 10 million times over the past 3 months on earnings calls and the like.
Conservative estimate.
Yes, exactly. Probably it's lowballing it. But you need that ability to anticipate. And if you can't anticipate because you don't know what, let's say, President Trump's going to do with tariffs next week, you have to at least be able to adapt quickly. And that's where consultants are pretty strong. Their whole job is to go in blind to a company, assess it very quickly, and then figure out what to do. So adaptability is one. Another one is just a sort of a facility with digits and data, let's call it, a tech savviness. They also have a good understanding of corporate cultures because, again, they have to come in, fly in, parachute in blind, get to read on a corporate culture quickly and sort of suss out, okay, what's going to be possible, within the scope of this engagement. And they are usually pretty good at selling themselves. These are consultants. That's sort of, if you're not good at selling yourself and your vision, you're not going to last very long at a McKinsey, a Bain, or a BCG. And so that is a huge part these days of a CEO's job.
So this new pipeline runs from the Accentures and the PwCs and the McKinseys of the world to these C-suites. Let me pose to you an age-old question, and that is, what do consultants actually do?
Well,
what are they so facile at?
That is the age-old question, certainly. What consultants do, I think, is a little bit different than what a lot of Americans think consultants do. They might just think of a consultant as, someone who jets in first class, comes to the company and has a quick look around and then delivers, a presentation. This is what you should do. Lay off 20% of your people, go into China, launch a new product. And then they skedaddle. They're gone. While that is one element of what some consultants do, usually more on the strategy side, what I learned in the course of reporting this story is that is not what most consultants are doing today. The big difference being that they are often sticking around and making sure that whatever they recommend, whether it's a new technology, a new way of management, they stick around and make sure it's actually working. So they're getting their hands dirty in a way that I don't think a lot of people recognize that consultants normally do.
We were talking about the kind of training apparatus that these old industrial companies built up, if that was a corporate campus or just a training program. Do you see the same thing playing out at these consulting firms? Do they have very rigorous training programs of their own with the goal of, yes, building up their own ranks, but getting people into the wider world?
I talked to the head of HR at Accenture. They spend as much on training, what they call learning and development, as GE used to spend on all of its Crotonville apparatus. Wow. Now, that said, Accenture has hundreds of thousands of employees, so there is a lot of training that needs to be done. But I've talked to other firms as well, and they're just getting a lot more rigorous about putting some structure behind this, which is a good thing, certainly. Now, we all laugh and joke about, I got to sit through a stupid, webinar, or there's some, course from HR I have to take. But these companies really take it super seriously, and they know if you're actually paying attention in some of this training. And granted, it shouldn't all just be boring webinars. It should be one-on-one learning with senior leaders, in-person stuff that you're not just going to do over a Zoom call. But the point is, whether it's Accenture or the Swiss staffing firm Adecco Group, when you talk to the heads of HR there, you really learn that they really have realized, wait a minute, we got to put some more structure and rigor into this training. So it's not just something you tick a box and do on a random Friday in the summer. It's something that you want to actually spend time on. It's going to make you a better employee and then a more employable executive, hopefully down the line.
Is the most common path to go from being a partner at one of these firms directly to becoming a CEO, or are there other stops along the way to that?
It should never be a direct path, actually, from partner at Accenture right into the C-suite. That is actually a recipe for disaster. Some of the advisors I talked to for this story had really said you have to allow them to make all the predictable mistakes in one or two, let's say, lower level corporate jobs. So usually if you're coming out of consulting and you get a corporate job, you should maybe work as an operations chief or a strategy chief is a very common one. Walmart and other companies have hired Bain consultants as heads of strategy. So then you get the feel for the company and the culture, and you're really immersed in it without having to be the sort of the be-all, end-all decision maker before you are elevated right into the CEO position.
I want to ask you about times when this has worked out well, drawing from the world of consulting, putting folks from there into the C-suite, and times when it hasn't.
Yeah, I mean, a good example, and this is a CEO I talked to, is a CEO of Randstad. Now, this is a company not a lot of Americans know about. But
staffing company.
Yeah, staffing company. They do a lot of, staffing solutions. If you've got a workforce issue, you'll call them in to fix it. They also own the job site monster.com, so some of us might know them that way. So anyway, their CEO is this Dutch guy. They're based in the Netherlands, and he had run two massive units of Accenture. He'd actually been there so long, he was there when it used to be called Anderson Consulting in the old days. But the point is, having talked to him, he got to know just about every industry under the sun, from retails to autos to utilities. So he had the industry knowledge of just about any industry, which is very helpful now that his clients are across industries. But he also was very good at deploying experts to fix whatever problems, issues their clients were having in his years in Accenture. And he's also he's a personable guy too. He's not this robotic consultant who just speaks like he's a PowerPoint in human form, which I think goes a long way as well. So when he missed out on the job of running Accenture, he was on everyone's short list to get a global CEO job, and he took the job at Randstad. So he's a great example of sort of a consultant made good.
Now, how about a couple examples when this hasn't worked out?
Yes. Well, the recent poster child for a consultant who did not turn out well in the C-suite was John Donahoe at Nike, a longtime Bain & Co. consultant, did very well there. He also had some other corporate roles before. He was at eBay, did extremely well there. So he was following the proper path, a couple of corporate roles and C-suite seasoning. But then he goes into Nike, which, is a challenging culture, a very challenging culture to come into from the outside. And it was a flame out. Now, it wasn't just because he was a consultant that it didn't work, but it sure as heck didn't help that he was trying to bring some of his Bain teachings into a culture. And sometimes these corporate cultures will just reject it out of hand and say, no, that's not how it's done here. This is not the Nike way. And, financial performance, COVID on top of it, a lot of things contributed to his downfall. But another one is the former CEO of Starbucks, who's a McKinsey alum. There you have a case of a founder, Howard Schultz, who just never really seems to go away.
Yes.
And maybe, he didn't have as much of a runway as he needed to do some of the things to turn Starbucks around, but there was not much patience given to him. And so he was out after just over a year.
I want to end with a philosophical question, and that is, what do we gain or lose by having a pipeline like this? Having this kind of mold of who the ideal CEO is, what does it mean that we're kind of restricting, a diversity of opinion or perspective on what that job entails or could entail?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And we are probably constraining and constricting ourselves a little bit to say that, okay, well, now we don't need to hire, the CEO doesn't have to be from GE, but he now has to be from Accenture. So, okay, you're not getting someone from this box, you're getting someone from a different box. Whereas, especially these days in the world of business, we really need to be hiring people who are not in a box at all, or at least willing to look up outside the box and have a peek around. But I think it's the job of corporations, though, when they are figuring out who's going to be leading us into this, wilderness that we're into right now, to be hopefully looking across the board at not just the people from, let's say, central casting, whether central casting is GE or now it's Accenture and McKinsey, and saying, or at least filling up the senior management roles with enough people who are willing to challenge orthodoxy, have a sense of, is this really the way we should be doing things, guys? And I think there's a lot to be said for maybe taking a chance, at least, on someone who's non-traditional type and, roll the dice there. Let's see what happens.
This is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. I'm David Gura. To get more from The Big Take and unlimited access to all of Bloomberg.com, subscribe today at Bloomberg.com/podcast offer. If you like this episode, make sure to follow and review The Big Take wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps people find the show. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.